So now we're going to move into a time of Q&A. I'll start here with a question from Slido.
Right.
Okay, so question number one.
Yeah.
You describe Christianity and Judaism as inherently different, but they're both founded upon the Old Testament. What differentiates Christianity in your eyes?
That's a great question. Wow. Off to a great start. The foundations are the same, but a lot like certain trees that have the same foundations or root systems, you're going to see some differences. There might be some similarities that make them look alike, but ultimately it's the growth, the outgrowth of it that's different. And how it's different is this, is that both Christianity and Judaism, and by the way, to say Judaism is a little bit of a misnomer because there's Judaisms, plural. There's various sort of iterations of it. There's a liberal Judaism, there's a conservative, there's rabbinic, different kinds of things. But essentially, when you look at the Old Testament specifically, what you'll see is that there's this nation of Israel which is established to be the progenitor of the Messiah who is to come. And that Messiah is to bring peace on earth and deliverance to all peoples, all nations, not just the Jews, but all nations. That's in the Old Testament. And you see prophecies of this in Isaiah 53, in Psalm 22, in Psalm 110. You see all these different places where this prophecy of a Messiah who is to come. Then the Christians would say that Jesus was, in fact, that Messiah, that he came on the scene as the incarnation of God, and he lived a perfect life to fulfill the Messiah's role, not just as the king, as a conquering king, but as a lowly servant. In fact, in early Judaism, right around the time, right before Jesus' time, there were two different disputes, or there was one dispute about who the Messiah would actually be. One of those was, will the Messiah be Messiah ben David, the Messiah, son of David, who would be a conquering king like David was, a warrior king? The others said, no, when we read the scriptures, the Old Testament, it looks like he is Messiah ben Joseph. He is the son of suffering because Joseph was one who suffered unjustly and eventually triumphed, not through violence or conquering, but through just faithfulness. So he could be Messiah ben Joseph. So for a long time, they were wrestling with, is the Messiah going to be like David, or will he be like Joseph? And along comes this Jesus who comes and says, yes, it'll be both. He'll be the suffering servant on the cross, but he will be the coming king when he comes back in his return. So the chief difference really between Judaism and Christianity is essentially who the Messiah actually is. Was Jesus, in fact, that Messiah? Most Jews, not all Jews, present company excluded, but for that matter, would say that Jesus is not the Messiah. But Jews who do believe in Jesus, Messianic Jews, would say he is, in fact, the Messiah. And what it means for him to be the Messiah is not that he ushers in temple sacrifice again and rebuilds the temple and all that. Rather, he is the one who is the ultimate fulfillment of all sacrifices so that there's no more need for the sacrifices and that the law is not abolished in the sense that it was bad, but it is actually fulfilled and no longer necessary to understand your place in God's economy. So you see the differences is Judaism starts with the hope of the Messiah and then says that he's not yet come. Christianity starts with the hope of the Messiah based in the same book and then says he in fact has come and has proven himself to be who he was in the person of Christ. That's the fundamental difference. And what does it mean for him to be the Messiah? Bill.
Is it? All right, next question. Why
Is there a live question, by the way? Because I'm cool with live ones too. So, yeah. We got a live one here. All right, no. They're going to have it. Psych?
My question is sort of building off of the joke he said earlier, but
Yep.
like I can sort of understand how maybe like Anglican and Lutheran are a little bit more similar, and then you can have Catholic and on the front of that maybe like Orthodox. I understand that Christianity is exclusive of other religions. To what extent would you say different denominations within Christianity are exclusive?
Great question. What's your name?
William?
William. Thank you for the question, William. So I think that I'm glad you asked the question the way you did, because to what extent are they exclusive? Most things, most terms are not absolute. Most terms are equivocal, and exclusivism can be equivocal. So I think in one sense, exclusivism from Christianity to other religious systems is unequivocal. There's only one way to heaven, and it's through Jesus and what he did on the cross. Within the interdenominational debates, and by the way, Christianity isn't the only one with this problem. Islam, there's a ton of different sects and different divisions within Islam. The Sunni Shia division has caused lots of problems for 14 centuries. And then even within the Sunnis and the Shia, there's all these different denominational issues, and they're pretty exclusive of each other. Just ask any Sufi how he's treated or she's treated by the Sunnis or by the Shia, and you'll find out just how exclusive they can be. So Christianity has this problem as well. It's still a problem within Christianity. What I would say, though, is that different denominations, for the most part, within the orbit of what C.S. Lewis called mere Christianity, which is the mere teachings, not mere in terms of like simplistic or not important, but mere, like the basic, is creation, the fall of mankind in terms of sin, redemption, and then the return of Jesus. Okay, those are the basics. Within those basics are some different details as well, like the divinity of Jesus, that Jesus is in fact the incarnation of God in the flesh. The Trinity is something that is foundational to the Christian faith, that Jesus died on the cross as a matter of history and rose again as a matter of history. Those are all part of the four things that make up mere Christianity. Denominations differ on a couple of different things regarding this, but almost none of them disagree on those issues I just said. So they might disagree on when do you get baptized, as an infant or as an adult? Or maybe not even as an adult, but as someone who knows what they're doing. Is it a conscious decision, or should you be baptized as an infant? Can you speak in tongues, which is one of the, if you don't know what this is, there's this idea of a spiritual gift where you speak in the spiritual language that requires an interpretation. Is that still something that happens today? Do miracles still happen today? There are Christians who think that they don't happen, and there are Christians who think that they do. Notice something. These big differences aren't all that big because they don't differ on the mains. Now, that isn't to say that there aren't, this is going to sound like a harsh word, but I mean in a technical sense, that there aren't cults of Christianity like Mormonism or Jehovah's Witness who deny central Christian doctrine. So Jehovah's Witnesses, for example, deny that Jesus is God. They claim that Jesus is the Archangel Michael, and he was a created being, and through him all other things were created, whereas the Bible pretty specifically teaches that Jesus is uncreated, and he, with God the Father, created all things. So those are fundamental differences, and that you can be exclusive on, because that's an essential. So how I would look at it is wrap it up in this one statement. And I don't know who said it. It's sometimes attributed to St. Augustine when he said, in the essentials, we need unity. In the non-essentials, things that are debatable about Christianity, we need liberty. But in all things, we should act with charity. So in essentials, unity. In non-essentials, liberty. But with all things, charity. And treat people with love. So we can divide over the mere Christianity. If you exclude that, that's a problem. But the denominational issues are mostly about sort of peripheral stuff. I hope that's helpful. Thank you so much. Yeah, appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks for your question.
Yeah.
All right, I'm going to take another one from Slido.
Mm-hmm.
So, how can I tell my non-Christian friends that Jesus is the right answer in a convincing way that leads them to change their worldview? I'm assuming this is from someone who is a Christian.
Sounds like it. It'd be weird if it wasn't. If it wasn't, please come talk to me afterwards. I'm dying to know what the thinking behind that was. But no, in all seriousness, I'm a big fan of listening before you tell anybody anything. I'm a big fan of asking questions rather than making statements, as long as you possibly can. You're at some point going to need to make a statement about what is true and what's not and these kind of things. But I'm a big fan of asking questions, and here's why. Because there are plenty of people that you look at a label and you see them and you say, okay, that person's obviously a Muslim, or that person's obviously a Hindu, or that person's said they're agnostic. And you hear the statements and you see the accoutrement that sort of tell you what they are and what they look like and what their beliefs might be. But then you talk to them for half an hour and you ask them questions about themselves and you get to know who they really are, and you find out they're not as agnostic as they once said they were, or they're not really all that committed to a Muslim, or they're not really all that committed to their Judaism, or whatever it might be. Or they say they're a Christian, but honestly, they're sort of a therapeutic moral deist, you know? So you find out by asking questions like, what are the big issues that bother you? What keeps you up at night? What are the things that haunt you in the middle of the night? Or when you think about spiritual matters, or even do you think about spiritual matters? So when you ask the questions, you find out who someone actually is. And the reason I say that is because the Apostle Paul says in Colossians, one of the books of the Bible, in Colossians chapter 4, verses 5 and 6, he says, walk in wisdom toward outsiders, making the best use of the time. In other words, answer the question they're actually asking. And I say this for a reason, because he's Mediterranean, he is Middle Eastern, Paul was. I'm Middle Eastern. If you're Middle Eastern in this room, you know this to be true when I say this out loud, is that we don't spend time efficiently. We just don't do it. We are just awful at this. I mean, if I walk into a person's home and I want to say hello to them, I say marhaba. Marhaba means hello in Arabic. And he's going to say marhabtain, which means two hellos. Now we're in a competition, to see who's more hospitable. And I say marahib, which means many hellos. He says alf marahib, which is 1,000 hellos. And I say alf marahib, 1,000 hellos, trying to make sure that he knows I'm more hospitable than he is. And then I start talking about his mother and asking about his dad and asking about the mother's dog and how's your aunt doing and doesn't she have a bunion and all this kind of stuff, right? And then after an hour of that, I get to the conversation. And that's Paul's culture. But he says, make the best use of the time. He's not saying be Swiss-like in your efficiencies. What he is saying is answer the question the person is actually asking. And then he says something beautiful. He says, let your speech be gracious, seasoned with salt, so you may know how you ought to answer each person. Not each question, not each worldview, answer each person. Because questions, worldviews, and controversies don't need answers. But people do need answers, and they use their questions, and they filter them through their worldview to get those answers, but you're always answering a person. So when you answer a person, you can never go wrong. It might take a long time, but find out what they care about. Can I just give a short example? This is a long answer to a short question, but I just want to give a short example of what I mean by this, is that I was talking to a young man, and I shared this story last year, I believe. I shared this story, but it's worth mentioning. And he was a young African-American man, and he had walked away from the Christian faith completely because he thought that Christianity was the religion of the slavers, that the Bible was used to justify slavery, and therefore it cannot possibly be a good book because it's horribly immoral. And we sat down for some time, and I asked this very, very brilliant guy, I said, clearly, justice issues are very important to you. He said, absolutely. I said, so it's a moral issue for you. It's a big moral claim. And he said, yeah, of course it is. Isn't it for you too? I'm like, oh, it is so much. And I'm so glad someone like you cares this passionately about it. I have a question for you, though. You claim to be an atheist, right? He said, yeah, you're a materialist. You believe that the material world is all there is. And he said, yeah. I said, so you don't have a soul and I don't have a soul? No. I said, well, so you're just basically a biochemical machine? He said, yeah. I said, and so am I. And he said, yeah. I said, how can one biochemical machine be racist to another one? My Apple iPhone is not racist towards my brother's Android. The whole idea of morality collapses when we begin to see ourselves in certain ways. And so I said, but you have this innate sense of justice, of morality, and it has to be born somewhere, it has to be grounded in something. And he liked that. We had this lengthy conversation about some troubling passages in the Bible that he found troubling. But the conversation was real and is authentic because I found something he cared about and then said, the gospel can actually tell you why you care about that. 3 weeks later, after a 5-hour conversation, I got a letter in the mail from him, an actual honest-to-goodness letter in the mail. It was the best thing ever. It's like opening a present on Christmas. And it just said, hey, I want to thank you for the conversation. I just started going to a Bible study at this Anglican church down the street. Find out what they care about, and then show them that the gospel addresses what they care about, and you can't go wrong. You might not get somebody to change their mind. That's not up to you, by the way. As a Christian, the Holy Spirit does that. But it is up to you to be faithful and actually care about the person you're talking to. So I'm so thankful for the question. Yeah. Is there a live one?
I'm transgender, and I have especially recently seen many Christians using religion to be bigoted and intolerant towards people like me. How do you respond to Christians who say that people like me need to deny who they are in order to accept the invitation to the banquet?
Yeah, thank you. What's your name? Cyan?
Cyan, like the color.
Oh, okay. Oh, Cyan like the color. Okay, cool. Thank you. Thanks, Cyan. I appreciate that.
Well, hey, friends, thank you so much for joining us for this episode. If you want to get more content like this and help support the ministry, a very easy way to do that is just to subscribe to us. Click the bell so you get notifications. Like the video, comment, take part in the conversation. And for those of you just listening to this and not seeing our beautiful faces live, you can just follow the podcast and rate it. That will help us get the word out. We thank you so much for taking your time to do that. God bless.
I realize this is one of those kind of questions that can be, the answer to which, no matter what I say, can be incredibly impactful, and it should be. It's rife with the value of who you are as a human being, okay? And I want to acknowledge that no matter what. I think that the fact is that no matter what the answer will be, someone's going to be upset, and I fully understand and appreciate that, and I'm not afraid of that, but what I am making sure is that I live out what the Apostle Paul says, which was to answer each person. So I'm not answering transgenderism as an ism. I'm answering you. And hopefully you feel the respect of that as we do that. The first thing I want to talk about is, again, your question is a morally laden question. It's an important question, and it's laced with morality. It's laced with the idea that treating people differently and prejudicially is inherently unfair. It's inherently wrong in some ways. So your question already posits the existence of objective moral values. Okay, so you believe in the objectivity of moral value. And I think that assumes something. If there's an objective moral law by which we judge that violates it or that which is conforming with it, then there's got to be something in the universe or something in existence that justifies the objectivity of that morality. Now, morality, contrary to Plato thought that these ideas of morality and love just exist out there, and there are things we have to conform ourselves to. But Platonism doesn't actually work because love doesn't love, and justice doesn't act justly, and kindness isn't kind. And so if they're not that way, then they violate themselves. And they don't actually have any causative powers in reality. So morality is not just these disembodied things that just out there you go, blub, 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 there it goes. I bumped into justice yesterday, and it felt, sharp and sort of sticky. It doesn't exist in the real world, as it were. So morality has to be based in persons, because chairs and morality and ideas aren't moral. Persons act morally. So morality is rooted in personhood. And so for morality to be transcendent, it has to be rooted in a transcendent person. And that's exactly what a Christian, or any theist for that matter, but a Christian would say who God is. Okay, so God is the transcendent source of morality. So the question you've asked, such a beautifully asked question, already assumes the existence, I think, inherently of a divine being. Now, the question is, what does that divine being say about you and me and everyone else in this world? Now, I take the words of Genesis to be true and to be valuable, is that when the Bible says in Genesis chapter 1, verse 27, it says, in the beginning he created them. Male and female did he create them. In the beginning did he create them. And there is no sense in the New Testament or the Old Testament of any spectrum or of any different view on this kind of a thing. So there is this sort of inherent binariness to sex and gender within the pages of the Scriptures. So if a Christian comes up to you and with shaking fist and anger in their tone tells you you're violating God's law and it goes into all this stuff like that, that tone doesn't exist in the Bible either in terms of who Jesus actually is. So what we have to do, what a Christian I hope would do, and if you've experienced the opposite of this, I can't be more grieved for you. When the tone happens, I think I can say with complete conviction there are two genders and there's no crossing over between the two. I think the science actually is in favor of this as well. But I do recognize there is an actual phenomenon that human beings go through, a real honest phenomenon called gender dysphoria. It's a real thing. It's exceedingly rare, but it's real, and it really happens. And those who are gender dysphoric don't ask for that. They didn't say, you know what, today, I think I'm going to upend my entire life. And they don't do that. I recognize that. Like most of the things that beset us in this world, there are things that make us incredibly uncomfortable. And people who have gender dysphoria are not living in a state of comfort until they sort of say, okay, this is where I find myself. And so they try to conform their body to their mind. I would say this. From a Christian perspective, what the Christian perspective says is that your body and your mind are both valuable and they need to be congruent. And they need to be inherently congruent. So with gender dysphoria, for example, this is one of the only sort of things, one of the only sort of psychological phenomena where when the mind is absolutely opposite of physical reality, it's the only one where we change physical reality to conform to the mind. We don't do it with anorexia. We don't do it with bulimia. We don't do it with any of those other things. With this one thing, for whatever reason, because it's so strongly felt and because it has so much emotional impact, from the various anxieties that come along with being gender dysphoric, from the depression that comes from it, from the various ideations that happen. It's serious. We have to treat this with compassion and understand what people are going through. We have to. We can't afford not to. It's cruel not to. But does that mean that I therefore have to affirm what someone says when I say, okay, the created order is male and female without any transition between the two or any way in which the mind is different from the body? I don't see that. So, the Christian message is not that when you and I resurrect, or when heaven comes, that you and I will be floating as disembodied spirits, playing harps on clouds. I mean, I hope that's not it. That sounds awful. But what the Christian message is that when you and I, if we have faith in who this Christ actually is, when you and I are resurrected, we will come back to our bodies, and our bodies will be glorified. There's this interesting story in the Bible where after Jesus is resurrected from the dead, bodily, his body comes back. His disciples are sitting in a locked room and they're hiding from the authorities. And this is found in John chapter 20, Jesus walks right through the locked door. Now he's a physical body, but he walks right through. The reason he can walk right through is because he's glorified. He's still physical, but he's not merely physical. There's an extra dimensionality to his physicalness because he is fully glorified in his body. Now, the reason why this is important and why it's so poetic, Sion, is because the Bible says that the word for glory in Hebrew means heavy. It means weighty. It means real. And so the reason why Jesus could walk through that locked door is because his glory was so heavy that he was the most real thing on earth. And the wood door was like smoke to him, and he could walk through. That is the kind of body that is awaiting you and awaiting me on the other side of heaven. My body right now rebels against me. Right now, all the time. I mean, I don't have the head of hair I'd like, just to be a little bit trivial about it. But I also have aches and pains, and my body is showing me the wrinkles over and over again of the things that this fallen world is showing. Gravity is having its effect. A number of things are having its effect. I have desires in me that I don't want. Desires in me that I know are wrong. Even things like desires about other people, like not even desires like lustful desires, but I mean like jealousies and anger and hypocrisy. These are things that beset me. And I'm looking for a time when these things will no longer be the things that beset me. I was not meant to be this way. My mind and my body are in rebellion against my spirit and against the original reason I was created. Is it my rebellion in my body and my disjointedness the same thing that you experience with you being transgender? No, it's not the same thing. And it might not even be the same intensity. I appreciate that. But it's of the same kind in terms of the thing that holds on to us. And so the Christian promise is not, you better get your act together or you're going to hell. That's not it. The Christian promise is that there's one who suffered for you more than you have suffered until the point where you've come. And he says, I know what suffering is like. I know what it's like to be in a situation where I am misunderstood and rejected. But he dies so that you and I can once again be understood. I think of a poem, if you don't mind my doing this, think of a poem by a man named Thomas Bracken. It's called Not Understood. And it goes like this. Not understood, we move along asunder. Our paths grow wider as the seasons creep. Along the years, we marvel and we wonder why life is life, and then we fall asleep. Not understood. Not understood. How many breasts are aching for lack of sympathy? Day by day. How many lonely hearts are breaking? How many noble spirits pass away? Not understood. And then he says this. He says, "Oh God, that men would see a little clearer, or at least judge less harshly when they cannot see. Oh God, that men would draw a little nearer to one another. Perhaps they would draw nearer to thee and then be understood." What I would say to you, Sion, is that being understood is not the same thing as being agreed with. And so I would say that I believe gender is binary and there's no crossing over between the two. But that is not something that should be served as a condemning, shaking their fist at you kind of a mentality. It's the kind of thing that all of us need to come to grips with, is that I'm not serving the good and the true about who I am, and I need someone to fix me from being who I am and to show me who I truly can be. And what I'm saying is Jesus offers that. There's a quote by Melinda Selmas, who is a transgender, she's a gender dysphoric woman. She believes in Jesus and she hasn't transitioned, none of that. But she says this, and I'm gonna sort of paraphrase it if you don't mind. This is a beautiful statement. I don't agree with everything she has to say, but I do agree with this. She said that suffering, in terms of what she suffered through and having gender dysphoria, is not meaningless in the Christian faith. It is not meaningless. And in fact, it is the very thing that brings oftentimes the most serious meaning in our lives. She said, suffering is the way in which we can recognize that Jesus himself was on that cross and suffered immensely for our sakes. And it was the nail scars in his hands and the wound in his side. And he was known by Thomas. And she says, I find it poetic that in the hereafter, in the resurrection, in the heaven to come, the only person who has scars is Jesus forever. You won't and I won't if we follow what he's done. So all the things that have been things in your life won't be there anymore. Will you struggle? Melinda Selma says yes. She struggles every day. There's still this pain and this agony that she goes through. But somehow, for whatever reason, in various forms, whether it's in your life or my life, suffering is sort of the way meaning is conveyed in this life. And how we deal with it can be augmented and changed when we embrace the suffering Messiah. It's not me who invites you to church. It's me who invites you to Christ. I've suffered, you've suffered, all of us. And what better companion can a suffering soul have than a suffering Savior? God bless. Thank you so much for the question, and thank you for the respect of honoring me with a tough one, and I appreciate that. I hope you felt respected. Thank you so much.
Yeah, that's good. All right, so we'll take a couple more questions, but after that, Abdu will again be here actually to chat with everyone else if you'd like. So I'll take one from Slido. That's been pretty popular. Why is birthplace or upbringing, which is an uncontrollable aspect of life, such a reliable predictor of salvation or damnation? How is this still considered tolerant?
That's a great question. I love this question because I literally embody the opposite of it. Birthplace can be a strong predictor of what someone believes. You know, if you were born in Russia in the 1980s, you're likely to be born into an atheistic home. If you're born in Afghanistan, you're likely to be a Muslim. If you're born in America, well, who knows exactly anymore, right? Who knows what you'll be, because it's the melting pot and different religions come here and all that stuff. So it's an important question. Here's the thing, though. It commits the genetic fallacy if you're thinking that where you're born, dictates what religion you are, and if that religion seems an arbitrary thing, like you happen to be born into a Muslim family and therefore you're Muslim, doesn't that make it equally as valid as Christianity, which you're born into, which is an arbitrary thing itself? It commits what's called the genetic fallacy, is that you judge whether or not something is true by how you came to that truth in the first place. How you came to it is irrelevant to whether it's true or not. So if you came to Christianity because you were born into a Christian home, it doesn't mean it's false or it's true. If you were born and you became an atheist because you were born into an atheist home, your parents were atheists, they taught you atheism, or they taught you non-religion, or whatever it is, and therefore you're an atheist. Does that suddenly make atheism false? Now what? That's the question. It's like, yeah, you're born into a home where, atheism, or Judaism, or Islam, or Christianity. Does that mean that religion is bunk? Or that we should be inclusive? Not necessarily. There's a fallacy that happens there. What I would say is this, is that the Bible actually predicts this. This is one of the things I love about the Bible, by the way, is that in so many ways, the pages of Scripture written 2,000 years ago are actually eternally contemporary, if I can quote from Leslie Newbigin. The Bible is our eternal contemporary. It was written thousands and thousands of years ago, and yet it answers modern-day questions all the time. So Acts chapter 17, the Apostle Paul, a Jew by birth, becomes a Christian because he encounters the risen Jesus, goes to a Greek city. There he is in Athens, the seat of all philosophy, the seat of various pantheons of gods, and the seat of some people who don't believe in any God at all. And he's sitting there, and he walks around and he says, I see that you're very religious. I see even there's an altar here to an unknown God. And he says, this God you don't know, I'm telling you who he actually is. He's Jesus and all this stuff. Well, they start listening to him. But Paul says something interesting. He says that God is not far from any one of us. He actually determines where each one of us is born so that we might search for him no matter where we're born, though he is not far from any one of us. I can tell you, I have the testimony of friends who I know were born in various countries extremely hostile to the Christian faith, where no Christian faith is preached, and yet they heard the gospel either by accident, they happened to turn on a television, and bam, they caught something on satellite TV, or Jesus did come to them in a vision or a dream. And then they began to explore these things, and they came to believe, not just because of the vision of the dream, but because they saw the evidence for the Christian faith. So God reaches in very, very tough places all the time. So the sort of happenstance of their birth was transcended by a God who interferes in life and says, not interferes in terms of robs you of your will, but gives you the answers you're looking for. So happenstance of birth can be something that can be overcome. But I'll tell you this. I was at the University of Calgary doing an open forum, and a young Hindu guy comes up to the microphone, and he says, essentially, if Jesus wanted me to be a Christian, why did he cause me to be born into a Hindu family? I said, what's interesting? You asked that question. Because Jesus is not interested in you becoming a Christian, whatever that label means. Jesus is interested in you following him. So here's my question for you. Here's my question for all of you, by the way. I said to this young man, I said, here you are, you're born into a Hindu family, but you're going to a secular university at a country that allows religious freedom and the freedom to convert to whatever religion you want. You came to an open forum where you actually are asking the question about religious diversity to a man who used to be a Muslim and is now a Christian, though he was born in a Muslim home. So the question you ought to be asking yourself is, if God wants me to be a Christian, why was I born into a Hindu family? The question you ought to be asking yourself is, why are you here now? Maybe God orchestrated things so that though you were born in India, you'd end up at that microphone asking me this question. Maybe God's providence has woven things so that your free will is exercised so that you can have an encounter with him. So the question isn't, where were you born? The question now becomes, will you be born again? And that's how I would answer the question. Yes, it is a strong predictor, but it's not ultimately determinative of what's true and what's not. Great question.
Yeah, we'll take this final question here and then we'll wrap things up.
So I grew up in a Muslim family and was an ex-Muslim yourself. I'm sure you're familiar with the fact that a lot of different faiths have their own mathematical, philosophical, or scientific miracles, and I'm curious how you choose to distinguish between miracles you choose to believe in when there's so many others that you fall for.
Yeah, great question. What's your name, sir?
Rakib.
Rakib. So you're a Muslim now?
Well, I'm in between things.
Yeah, I remember that. I remember doing the same thing. I appreciate that. Great question, Rakib. I really appreciate it. So here's what I would do. And I think it's fitting to be answering this question in this particular kind of a university where I would weigh the evidence for each one of those miracles and find out whether or not there's and be as skeptical as you can about them. All of them, by the way. So let me give you a quick introduction to this, about my own mindset towards this. What got me started on the path to examining whether Christianity, Islam, or Hinduism, or Buddhism, or any other ism and schism I could think of was true was an encounter in the Bible. I was reading a Bible to try to knock the faith out of these two Christians who were coming to my door every day to preach Jesus to me. So I read the Bible to find a contradiction in it, and I come across Luke chapter 3, verse 7 and following. And John the Baptist says to those who are coming to him, he says, "Who told you to flee from the wrath to come?" Meaning God's judgment for your sins. "I tell you, do not even begin to say to yourself, you have Abraham as your father." In other words, you being a child of Abraham won't save you. He says, "Because I tell you, God can raise up children of Abraham from the stones." What that meant to me was tradition does not save you. Truth is what saves you. And if you're biased towards your tradition, you might be getting in your own way. And so I recognized that I think I'm being biased toward my own tradition. So that started me on this 9-year journey where I began to examine the various miracle claims of the various worldviews, whether it's Islam or Hinduism or Christianity, whatever it is. And so I began to look at sort of the miraculous nature of the Quran and all the claims I had come to believe over the course of my life. Were they really in fact true? Are there mathematical, wonders in the Quran or not? Or are they mere coincidences? Can you do the same thing with different documents? I'll give you an example of this. There's a guy who claimed that the number 19 exists because of a surah in the Quran, or an ayah, a verse that says, "Over it are 19." It's a very enigmatic verse. And he says, well, this enigmatic verse must mean something. So multiples of 19 would exist in all these crazy places all throughout the Quran, proving that it's a mathematical miracle that a Bedouin merchant in the middle of Arabia could not have come up with. It's got to be from God. Well, the problem is when you use his mathematical method, you can do the same exact thing with the Declaration of Independence. You can do it with a phone book. So it looks like a cool trick, but it really isn't much more than a cool trick. So you have to have more than that. The central idea of Christianity is that Jesus rose from the dead. Every other miracle in the Bible, there's no evidence other than the eyewitness testimony written down in the scriptures themselves. But for the resurrection, we have a lot of testimony, a lot of evidence for it. We have not only the words of the New Testament written by people who claim to have been there, and if they were wrong or if they were lying, they would have known about it, because remember, these men did not claim, and these women did not claim, someone told me he rose from the dead. They're saying, I was there, I saw it. Now, if they were lying, they know it. And all of them were either willing to or did in fact die for that claim. And none of them recanted, none of them. And there's various testimonies outside of the apostles of having seen it. In fact, so good is this evidence that you have non-Christian historians, whether it's Josephus in various forms, or Suetonius, or Cornelius Tacitus, or Pliny. You have other people who were writing at the time, Mara Bar Serapion, and all these extra-biblical sources, non-Christians who were saying this belief was so common that the Christians who were there were willing to die for what they had to have known was a lie. But they didn't think it was a lie. They were so convinced that they saw him with their own eyes. So I weigh the various miracles and the evidence for those miracles individually to see what might turn up. What ends up happening is, unlike, I think, the Christian faith, you don't have a lot of corroboration for some of these things. In Islam, there's what's called Isra wa Miraj, right? So you have Muhammad going to the Dome of the Rock, and then he gets occulted up to heaven, and he interacts with Moses and Abraham and Jesus and all these things, and he has this conversation with them. It's an important miracle within the Islamic context. But when you look into the actual history of this, you see that there's no eyewitness testimony of it. No one was actually there to see him go up or even be transported from Mecca all the way to Jerusalem. You don't see any eyewitness testimony of it. So the claim is there, but is there evidence in favor of it? So I look at these other miracle claims and I begin to see these are not as strong as the central claim of Christianity, which is that Jesus died and he rose from the dead. That's what I would say is the big issue. I would weigh those miracle claims on their own merit. Now, when it comes to Islam, the issue here is not even a miracle claim. It's a historical claim. In the Quran, it literally says, مَا قَتَلُهُ وَمَا صَلَّبُهُ لَكِنْ شُبِّهَ لَهُمْ. They did not kill him, nor did they crucify him, meaning Jesus, but it looked like it to them. Every other document in history that talks about Jesus, acknowledges his death on the cross. Anything that's contemporary, not every other document. There's a bunch of Gnostic documents that are written hundreds of years later or far after the events, but the earliest documents corroborate Jesus died on the cross. In fact, so sure of this is Dr. Bart Ehrman, who is no fan of Christianity, and John Dominic Crossan and all these guys. They'll tell you that Jesus' death by crucifixion is as sure a fact as anything could ever be historically. And yet the Quran denies it. So you have to weigh that issue. So before we even get to the miracle claims, let's get to the historical claims, the not so fantastic claims, and see if they're true as well. So I hope that's helpful to keep. But thank you so much for the question. I really appreciate it. Everyone, that's the last question, I presume.
Yeah.
Guys, thank you so much for giving me the time and your patience. I really appreciate it. You've been wonderful to speak with. I hope we could engage more on some of these issues, and I hope that you've felt as respected by me as you have respected me. God bless you guys.